24 years, Frank Church was one of Idaho's most powerful political figures, a four-term senator, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, presidential candidate. He lives in Washington full-time now and says he'd like to be Secretary of State. I'm Jean McNeil. Tonight on The Reporters, a conversation with Frank Church, 1/2 hour from now, following the McNeil-Lehrer report.
Funding for The Reporters is provided by Friends of Channel 4 Incorporated and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Good evening. For 24 years, from 1956 until his defeat in the 1980 election, Frank Church was one of Idaho's most powerful political figures. For many of those years, perhaps the most powerful. A four-term senator, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, candidate for president. He was also, to some observers, an anomaly on the political scene. A Democrat in a predominantly Republican state, a liberal in essentially a conservative state, an expert on foreign policy in a state far removed from most international concerns. Frank Church no longer lives in Idaho. He is now a partner in a New York-based law firm with offices in Washington, D.C. But he is in Boise this week attending his 40th high school reunion, and tonight we talk with him. Welcome to the program, Senator Church.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Let me turn first to an issue on a great many minds these days, the fighting in Lebanon. Israel now accusing the PLO of violating the 7th ceasefire of that fighting. How do you assess the current situation over there?
Well, first of all, of course, it's a tragedy, this kind of war. Lebanon has been a tragedy in many ways for years. I had hoped that the Israeli forces might have stopped at the Iraqi River, pushing back the PLO guerrillas beyond the range of their mortar, artillery, and missile fire to protect the communities of northern Israel. I think the whole world would have accepted that as a necessary defensive measure. But the war's taken a different turn, and now I suppose we should hope that out of this adversity may come the opportunity that has been lacking in the past. The opportunity first to return Lebanon to the Lebanese, to enter into arrangements that will cause the Syrian army to withdraw from northern Lebanon, the Israelis from southern Lebanon, and perhaps inject an international peace force under the United Nations to preserve order in Lebanon until the government there can take effective control of the country. Now, if that could be done, then you would have a peaceful Lebanon restored to the Lebanese, and that would be a building brick toward a broader peace in the Middle East.
So perhaps some good might come out of it.
Might come out of it. It's too early to say.
But Israel perhaps went a little farther than you are willing to support.
Well, I think that it went further than you could justify on purely defensive grounds. Now, I believe they thought that cleaning out the PLO was a necessary step. And perhaps, as I say, out of this present condition, we might find a means to clear Lebanon of all of the intruders and restore it once again to the Lebanese people.
Where would that leave the other issues, the issue of the recognition of Israel's right to exist and the Palestinian homeland question? There was some indication earlier this week that people thought perhaps PLO leader Yasser Arafat was coming around. Now the administration says it was nothing new. Do you see any progress?
No progress yet. The statement was a very clever statement, and it was written in a way that suggested at first that he had changed his position. But when you read it carefully, he said that he would abide by all the relevant resolutions of the UN. Of course, he defined those as excluding Resolution 242 and 338, which are the basic resolutions upon which American policy has long been based, and which accord to Israel recognition of its right to exist. So no, Arafat did not change his position. So I see no progress yet on that front.
What does Israel have to give? Prime Minister Menachem Begin said the other day that even if Yasser Arafat acknowledged Israel's right to exist, he would never talk with him. Does Israel have some things that it needs to give?
I think that if there's to be peace in the Middle East, the Palestinian question has to be addressed and has to be resolved. An attempt to do that was included in the Camp David Accords, where the Egyptian government and the Israeli government agreed to the concept of an autonomy for the Palestinian people on the West Bank for a 5-year period, after which a permanent solution would be worked out. Unfortunately, neither side has been able to agree as to what autonomy means, and those talks have broken down. And the Begin government has become more and more inclined to look to the West Bank as an area for new settlements, making its future more and more dubious. But there'll never be a just and lasting peace in the Middle East until Israel has a recognized right to exist within safe, defensible borders. And the Palestinian question has been resolved in a just fashion.
How about America's recent role in that region? There are those who believe that if we had taken a stronger hand in the Mideast in recent months, perhaps the Lebanon situation wouldn't have gotten to the point that it did. How are we doing, in your view, in the Middle East right now?
Well, I think that we have not been able, under this administration, to redefine an American policy. One of the signal accomplishments of the Carter years was the Camp David Accords. It was the first breakthrough that brought peace between Israel and the largest of her Arab neighbors, Egypt. So since that time, we've been looking for a new American policy to broaden the peace achieved at Camp David. Secretary Haig had a notion that perhaps the countries of the Middle East should recognize the danger posed by the Soviet Union, and this would pull them together. But he was soon to discover that the countries of the Middle East did not regard the Soviet Union as the principal threat. Rather, they looked. That didn't work. They were looking closer to home, and the world was not nearly so simplistic a place as this administration has tended to view it. So we're still floundering for a new policy, a sequel to Camp David.
Do you see any of the tilt that some people are talking about as the result of increased emphasis on oil, as the result of perhaps the 1980 election, slightly more pro-Arab feeling in Congress, and now the transition from Alexander Haig to George Shultz? Is there going to be a shifting, a tilting toward Arab?
It's too early to say what Shultz will do as Secretary of State. He does have connections with the Arab world through his business, through Bechtel, that maintains many large contracts in Saudi Arabia and in the Arab countries. But oil is very influential. We hear lots of talk about the Jewish lobby, for example, and it exists, and it works very hard to influence American policy. You know, we Americans are a polyglot people, and our policy is not as easy to formulate as, say, the French or the German or the British, because we have large blocks of distinct groups, like the Jews in this country, like the Poles, like the Irish, and all of them, of course, have the right to try and influence our policy. But what's been lost in all of this is the great power of the oil lobby. In the contests in Congress in recent years, it hasn't been the Jewish lobby that has prevailed in contested matters like the sale of F-15s and AWACS to Saudi Arabia, for example. It's been the so-called Arab lobby and the oil connection. That's been the lobby with the greatest clout in Washington.
Too much power as far as you're concerned? Dangerously?
Well, I worry about it, yes, because I think that, among other things, it has caused us to simply throw over the energy program that we were beginning to develop to give this country a larger measure of independence in an area so vital as fuel supplies. Now that's all been just dismantled Even the Energy Department itself is on the way to being dismantled, and all our alternative fuel programs and synthetic fuel programs are being progressively dismantled. And that's going to throw us back again into the clutches of the OPEC cartel. And that worries me. Franklin Roosevelt used to say, you can't win an election without the oil companies, and you can't govern with them.
Before we leave the Middle East and move on to something else, briefly, another conflict, the Iraqi War. How do you see the United States' interests in that war?
I think we should stay out of it entirely. It's far too complicated a matter involving the Shiite and the Sunni Muslim religious factions. It is a war that's difficult, really, for us to understand. And if we try to intervene one way or another, both countries will resent it.
Is there a threat to our oil interests there?
Not yet. It's possible that a threat could develop in the future, but in all likelihood, the oil fields on which we heavily depend, those around the Gulf, can be protected against either the Iraqis or the Iranians. And I see no present threat of a Russian intervention, which would be the serious development that we all hope will not occur. And right now, there doesn't seem to be much indication that it will occur.
Let me turn to something that I know is of concern for you, this country's relations with Western Europe and the Soviet Union, particularly Reagan's ban on sales of gas pipeline equipment to the Soviets, with which our allies are clearly not going along. How serious is the rift that's been created there?
The most serious that I can recall.
Reagan says it's like a family, it's just a family
you know,
dispute.
The family does not consist of a papa in the United States and children in Western Europe. That's the way we tend to treat the allied countries in the NATO alliance. But they are proud, and they are sovereign, and they are independent nations. And they have made a very careful assessment of their needs. Unlike the United States, they have not abandoned an energy program. They know that the two great oil shocks inflicted by OPEC have cost the economies of the Western world $1.2 billion in lost productivity and rising inflation. Far greater blow than anything that all the communist countries of the world combined have ever inflicted.
So they're looking out for their...
They're looking out for a new solution. And they want to reduce their dependency on the Middle East. And to do this, they know that one of the things they must do is to bring gas in from Siberia. Now, they've made an assessment of how this will affect their security, and they've decided that their interests are best served by achieving this degree of diversity. Now, we come along, and, you know, we can argue with them that they shouldn't do it. That's our prerogative, and I don't quarrel with the argument. But once they've decided to proceed, and then we step in and say, we're not going to permit you to do it. Papa knows best, and we're going to penalize you if you do it.
We just have to accept.
You know, I mean, what happens then? We have American-owned businesses in Europe. They must abide by the laws of the countries in which they do business. What are they to do? France and Germany says, proceed to abide by the contracts you've entered into. And the United States says, no, if you do that, we will engage in reprisals against the parent company in the United States.
What about the...
Now, that's a row that causes the Europeans to feel like we're treating them not as sovereign equals, as partners, but as satellites. Indeed, that we're treating them much like the Russians treat the satellite countries in Eastern Europe. And there's a deep resentment against us.
What about the policy theory behind it, leaving aside the question of the Allies' difference with us? Reagan's philosophy is obviously to try to deny access to at least part of the American marketplace to the Russians, try to weaken their economy still further, try to give them less money to spend in Cuba and other places like that. Does that theory hold up as far as you're concerned?
It doesn't work, Gene. There have been times when I've supported sanctions in the past in the hope that they might work, but looking back over our experience, none of those sanctions have ever worked. And Reagan himself admitted as much when he said, the United States alone cannot impose sanctions against the Soviet Union that will be effective. Yet he continues to do it. And what is it going to produce? It's not going to stop the pipeline. In the end, they'll have the pipeline, and we'll have the ill will. Moreover, the Russians will have to manufacture certain kinds of equipment that they now lack the capacity to manufacture. And instead of our selling them that equipment, they'll develop their own capacity to produce it. So they'll emerge all the stronger as a result. It's a policy that doesn't make any sense at all.
What's your analysis of the Soviet economy? Do you think it's in as bad shape as the administration is indicating that it is?
I think the Soviet economy is very inefficient. The communist system is such a bureaucratic system that they haven't been able to overcome many of their economic problems. But they're smart people, and when they address themselves to a given problem, whether it be first in space, when they launched the satellite in '57 and surprised the world, or developing this new technology that will enable them to build the pipeline, they'll do it. They'll do it.
What about the theory that the stronger their economy is, the more likely they are to engage in adventurism? Do you buy that as a theory?
No, it's just the opposite. Actually, experience proves just the opposite. I think that the only way that we can preserve peace in this world is for the United States and the Soviet Union to reach some kind of accommodation. We're either going to coexist on this planet, or we're going to engage in the hellfire of a nuclear war that will obliterate both the United States and the Soviet Union. So our policy, instead of being one of confrontation and ineffectual reprisal and strident denunciation, which moves us step by step closer to the risk of a nuclear war, should be one that seeks a way that we can, a modus vivendi.
What do you do when an Afghanistan occurs, when a Poland occurs?
You recognize that that's the way big powers behave. We see the Soviet Union as aggressors in Afghanistan, where they certainly have moved in with their army. We resent the way that they're pressuring the Polish government to establish and maintain internal order through martial law. But on the other hand, the Russians see us as intervening in small countries in the Central American part of our own hemisphere, pushing them around, determining which governments they shall have, undertaking to put down civil war in countries where the conditions of life are quite unbearable. We see them as dangerous aggressors out to communize the world. They see us as imperialists out to dominate the world.
And there's truth on both sides.
Yes, there is some truth on both sides. What this country needs, what our foreign policy needs and lacks, is perspective. And unless we gain that perspective in this dangerous nuclear world in which we live, there is this fearful danger that both superpowers will incendarize themselves in a nuclear war.
What about our perspective in Central America? This week, certification to Congress that there's progress in El Salvador on human rights and land reform. Are you satisfied with the evidence of progress?
Well, I hope there's progress there in the way of land reform. I don't know. I haven't been to El Salvador, and I think even if I went, it would be difficult to know what's actually going on. I'm a bit skeptical because American policy has been more inclined to support petty dictators in Central America, despite the injustice of life and the poverty and the oppression. Through the years, we would prefer dictators as long as they were anti-communist and pro-American to doing something about the underlying conditions that give root to these revolutions. And so I'm a bit skeptical when I hear from this administration that things are going well, that the reforms are taking place, and that human rights in these countries are being respected, that progress is being made. I hope it's true.
Is there a middle ground? Is there a way of dealing with a dictator, an anti-communist dictator who may also be support repressive policies, violence against citizens? Is there a way that the United States can deal with that kind of a government to improve conditions and at the same time maintain its ally?
I think we have to recognize that governments come in various forms. There are right-wing dictatorships, there are left-wing dictatorships, there are monarchies, there are free governments, but not very many. And we have to accept the world pretty much as it comes. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to extend military and technical assistance to a dictatorship that is brutalizing its own people, kidnapping them in the night, taking them into prisons, beating and torturing them. We don't have to give aid to that kind of a government. We're not so insecure that it's necessary for us to do that simply because the local dictator is anti-communist and uses that to appeal to us for assistance. I think we have to accept the governments in this world pretty much as they are, do what we can to persuade them to undertake policies that will improve the underlying conditions of life and increase the standard of living. I think the President of the United States should speak out for human rights. If he doesn't, who will in this world? And that's a part of our tradition. But we have to get over this notion that we can restructure and remodel the world. That is really beyond our capacity. And furthermore, we must get over the even more dangerous notion that we can stifle revolution wherever it occurs in the third world. We're living in a time of revolution, in a time of ferment in the third world. And that's going to go on for as long as we can now foresee.
And you don't see a lot of that as simply a Soviet...
And to simplify that in such juvenile terms as to assert, like the President and his spokesman have often asserted, that all of this is manufactured in Moscow and exported, well, it's just beneath the level of analysis and understanding that we ought to expect from the government of the United States.
The Sandinistas in Nicaragua are not...
The Sandinistas were revolutionaries. They were leftists. Many revolutions will be directed by leftists in countries like Nicaragua. But what do we accomplish by attempting to stifle that revolution or attempting to isolate a country that goes through a grassroots revolution? What have we accomplished in that effort against Cuba all these years? We have not cut Cuba off from the rest of the world. We have not embargoed in Cuba successfully. Cuba is doing trade today with nearly every country in the world. The only country we've succeeded in isolating is the United States. And Castro, by continuing to maintain this sort of pressure, by actually engaging for 3 years in attempts to assassinate Castro, we've made him bigger than life. We've made him a great hero in the third world. We've kept him in power whenever he was in difficulty because he could blame his difficulties on the United States.
So it's self-defeating.
Self-defeating. I wish we could just relax enough to recognize that this country is like the Rock of Gibraltar in this world. It's a tremendously strong country, strong and stable. And the rest of the world, or much of it, is in wretched poverty, and conditions of life are unbearable, and oppression is fierce. And there's going to be a revolution. We once were a revolutionary country 200 years ago. We first asserted the right to our own independence against foreign oppressors. And we should have a better understanding of what's going on in our time and recognize that these revolutions can occur and they'll have no more effect upon our well-being in the long run than the waves that wash upon the rocks of Gibraltar.
In the last 3 minutes approximately, I must ask you a couple of political questions. Clearly the Democrats are counting heavily on the economic conditions in the country to help them politically in the fall. Are they going to also have to come up with some very specific, very clearly understood alternatives to Reagan's economic program? And if so, do you see those coming?
I doubt that they will. Mostly parties out of power, the opposition party, just points to the failures of the party in power. And of course the Reagan program has been largely adopted in the Congress. The economy has gotten weaker and weaker. Unemployment has reached 9.5%. The interest rates are still too high to permit a recovery to commence. The supply side economics has clearly failed. And who wants to run on that? Not the Republicans. So they're contriving an amendment to the Constitution to divert public attention. And that amendment will force office holders in the future, presumably, to balance the budget.
Will it work politically?
It might. If they can do it with mirrors again. After all, supply-side economics worked. And anybody who took a minute to reflect on that should have seen that you couldn't increase defense spending hugely and cut 30% off of government revenues and balance the budget at the same time. And that's why we're now faced with deficits twice as big as any that ever occurred under a Democratic president.
Do you care to make a prediction as to how the Democrats will do in November?
I think they'll pick up strength. How much, I couldn't say. The president, despite the failure of his program, remains personally popular. And he's very graceful in the way he conducts his office. So that will be helpful to the Republicans. Nevertheless, I think the Democrats will gain in the Congress perhaps as many as 20, 25 seats.
In the 1 minute left, look ahead to 1984 and tell me what you see on the Democratic presidential horizon.
I see a lot of horses at the gate. And the race begins after this next election. Then we'll get a better idea of who's doing what in the primaries. I wouldn't know how to predict the outcome of the race, who's going to finish first. In the last few years, we've discovered that no one really can forecast how the primaries will turn out. But it's going to be interesting. There are going to be a lot of candidates, and I hope we emerge with a winning candidate in '84.
You have not latched on to a personal favorite at this point?
Not at this time. It's too early.
Thank you. We're out of time. Senator Church, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
That's all for tonight. We'll be back here tomorrow night. I'm Jean McNeil. Good night.
This program is produced by KAID-TV, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for the reporters is provided by Friends of Channel 4 Incorporated and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.